Good morning. Welcome to Day 3 of the European Environment and Sustainable Development Advisory Council's annual conference on the digital transformation and the Anthropocene. We're looking at the twin challenges of a very large transformation that's happening on the technological side, dealing with digital technologies and artificial intelligence, and on the sustainable development dimensions of transformation that include environmental and ecological factors, as well as questions of inclusivity. And today we'll also have a large focus on European norms and values, the ethics associated with transformations. And today I'm very happy to wrap up very quickly what we did in the last 2 days. We've had a large focus on the ways that digital transformations can assist our sustainable development transformations, the many opportunities there are for efficiency improvements, resource use improvements, that there are ways that we can interconnect with digital technologies that haven't been possible in the past. At the same time, we talked about some of the European policies and projects that are underway trying to advance this transformation, both on the sustainable development and on the technological sides. But we also talked about some of the potential unintended consequences of transformations, leaving people behind, or concerns about digital technologies being used in ways that could also undermine European norms and values. And thus, we will see today that these are major concerns, that we need to think much more about how we can integrate the dimensions of sustainability, norms and values and ethics, and the digital transformation. Today, to help us with this discussion, I'm happy to welcome Alex Gutierez Margarit, who is a well-known journalist here in Catalonia. He will be helping us with a roundtable moderation. And to start, I turn the floor over to Alex.
Thank you, Miranda, and welcome. Let me welcome, actually, our speakers for this session on alphabetical order. I'll start with Gemma Caldon Clavell. She's the founder and CEO of Eticas Consulting. Then we have also Anne Marie McGauren. She's an expert working at the National Economic and Social Council in Ireland. And to my left, joining us live in the studio is Simona Levi. She's founder of XNET. So welcome all you three. And we will have an exchange on ethics, equity, and inclusion and in the digital era. And we'll do so with these three colleagues that come from different but complementary angles. So colleagues, you are kindly invited to kick off our roundtable with some introductory statement, and later we will engage in some dialogue. And also I'd like to point out and invite the audience that they can leave their questions, dilemmas, statements that I can bring to the table this morning. So if you want to do so, I certainly encourage you to do so. You can use the buttons in your screen below. So let's start with Simona. She's just here to my left, and let me ask her, how can digitalization be a lever for democracy?
Okay, so good morning, and yes, let's talk about how to reach a real democracy in the Anthropocene. So the digital age offers opportunity for the advancement of democracy that have yet to be fully exploited. This is why it's not sufficient to look at digital solely in terms of technology. Digital expand the means of communication between human beings as writing and printing press did in the past. In other words, it has created again the condition for the disintermediation in respect of the previous status quo by democratizing access to information. This means provides citizens with more possibility to exercise the ability to choose, to decide, in some to exercise co-responsibility. Co-responsibility is right at the heart of the etymology of democracy. In other words, within the representative democracy we are in, we are talking about accomplishing an higher potential of democracy by citizens supervising and contributing to their institution and infrastructure in a more continuous and consistent way than every 4 years with elections. Thanks to this configuration as a decentralized and distributed network, the very structure of the internet not only enables this, but also it offers a model for a new architecture of governance. The idea of a system formed into a network comprised node of distributed leaderships. It transcends the dichotomy between vertical and horizontal governance, permitting a distributed leadership system. As such, distributed governance adapts to the condition of human organization and of many other biological, social, and technological networks, as shown by studies on the property of scale-free network and on the 1% rule of participation inequality. This rule is very important. The 1% rule of participation inequality shows that the actual nature of human behavioral way of cooperation means organization and governance is that each individual participates inequally in various decisions or action, sometimes being part of this 1% of the leading group, with other acting as support for the group that lead, or other acting passively in a monitoring function for accountability. This is how we could enable a new democratic culture that should be reflected in the policy and in the infrastructure that we use, a more distributed democracy within the representative democracy. But democracy is also evening out asymmetry, should be evening out asymmetry of power. It also means citizen controls and as efficient as possible over their institution and infrastructure, not the other way around. This means privacy, transparency for institution and privacy for the people. The great totalitarianisms of the 20th century has forced to reflect on the devastating dangers of control and profiling citizens. In this context, the term democide was coined, accompanied by the horrifying evidence that democide, the massacre of the population by its own government, may kill more people than conventional war. A very tight societal control of population, profiling in combination with mass propaganda, are the prerequisite for wiping out a population. This is why the right to personal data protection is so important. It is a private-related fundamental right that guarantees people's control over their data. Simply put, when we discuss data, it's very simple. We discuss control. Who can know who we are, where we live, what we do during the day and during the night, what tastes, convictions, vices, pleasure, need, or sorrow we have. In other words, it entails asking ourselves who controls us. With the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, Europe managed to set up a first obstacle to the renewed public and private interest in asymmetrical control over the population. One of its key principles is the idea that people's privacy must be guaranteed by design and by default, instead of being a complementary feature on and off. In order to avoid a misleading interpretation of this legislation, I have to recall that it is important that protection of personal data increase democracy only together with a strong institutional transparency, also by design and by default. The way to enable, to audit the digital tools and infrastructure to ensure that these principles are met is if their source code is accessible to be audited in a distributed, disintermediated, democratic way. From this perspective, the open source tools should be a requirement for public strategies because of their auditability and also because it permits to be reused, reducing our digital footprint. But when we talk of disintermediation, we know that a reintermediation follows. In an idea of disintermediate and distributed sovereignty, that reaches the smallest unit of democratic architecture, I mean every single citizen, the fact that only few big tech are the ones that more intensively provide the public digitalization with code that is not auditable, even in the context of institution and essential services, is a sign that we send the wrong signal to the market. And this signal is that digitalization can take place by sacrificing small and medium-sized companies, by sacrificing innovation as a valuable and distributed human capacity, and sacrificing very often human rights themselves. On the contrary, I wish and work to envision opportunity to restructure the economy after COVID crisis from the standpoint of democratic and sovereign digitalization, in which human rights are the raw material for entrepreneurial design. Keeping in mind many lessons from history, Keeping in mind many lessons from history, we can be aware so that digitalization doesn't succeed at the expense of human rights as collateral damages. At the moment, between 80 and 90% of our data are not in sovereign structures. To solve this, my organization has designed a plan for democratic digitalization that aims to be an avant-garde in solving the following problem detected on the ground in a case study starting from the educational field. First, there is a lack of institutional data storage services that allows users full control on their data and effective legal protection. Second, there is a lack of institutional use of user-friendly and agile tools for generating content and operating online that allow the auditability of their code and full interoperability so to ensure data sovereignty for the people. The tools exist, but they are not promoted. 3, there is a deficit in the enforcement of the GDPR owing to several problems, including the vitiated consent to infrastructural conditions and the protection of citizens. Fourth and last, small and distributed businesses that could solve this problem are de facto excluded to the structural digitalization. This produces a circle in which they are not ready to contribute to it. This is a problem of institutional will, design and founding, which perpetuate the monopolistic digital monoculture that brings about the problem that I've just detailed and create captive customers. In sum, all these problems need a radical change of policy, because democracy in the digital age will be distributed or will not be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simona, for sharing these remarks with us. And now we are going to Gemma. I wanted to ask Gemma what needs to be done to protect citizens from potential unethical use of AI systems. The question is simple, but I'm sure that the answer is not. So let's hear from you, Gemma.
Thank you so much. Actually, at Eticas, our mission is to protect people in technology processes precisely because that is not being done. I think it's quite remarkable and quite sad and quite worrying that at this stage of the digital era, we still have to emphasize that protecting people is a challenge that we have ahead because no one has thought about this. And before going about how to do it, let me first talk a little bit about how we got here. Because when we talk about ethics and equity and inclusion in the digital age, they're basically not there. I still remember the CEO of Zoom, the application that we've used so many times during the pandemic, discuss about a year and a half ago when it was found that pedophiles were bombing school meetings that were being done remotely because of the pandemic, He was interviewed and he quite candidly admitted that they had never thought about privacy and security as some of their biggest challenges. They were so focused on the business model and the technical specifications that they forgot to think about people, the very same people that would be a fundamental part of that business model. But I think that's quite common in the technology industry. For some reason, people have only been seen as a resource and not as an actor to be protected. So we have found an industry that doesn't care about people because of its own business model, which is based on gathering all our data and being non-transparent at all about how this is done. But also an industry that initially designed their systems for leisure activities. And so the current AI models that we are using were initially designed for things like Spotify, Netflix. So to decide how to predict what you would like to see after you see a film. And when we see that these same models are being now transferred to education, health, social services, we have a huge problem, because the amount of mistakes and the level of inaccuracy that we could afford when recommending someone whether to watch a film or not, we cannot afford when we're thinking about health issues or social services. So on the one hand, we have an industry that has completely disregarded users as subjects of rights. And we also have the regulator, which has utterly failed to foresee that this was the case, and therefore has not enacted the necessary mechanisms of protection that would ensure that we are protected under those systems. So today we have an industry that is completely unregulated, that continues to claim the right to be unregulated, and that requires for itself a degree of lack of regulation that we wouldn't allow any other industry. Like, no one thought in the midst of the pandemic, when we were developing the vaccines, no one thought, oh, well, because there's people dying, let's forget about clinical trials. No one thought about this possibility. Of course, we speeded up processes, but we didn't forego necessary protections that need to be in place to ensure that whatever you are giving the population, in this case vaccines, is something that can be trusted and that will not cause more harm than good. These same protections that we ensured were in place during the development of the vaccines, we constantly agree to not hold the technology industry to the same standards. And so we tell them, sure, you can develop whatever you want, and you can just launch it in the market, and it can reach the population directly with no mediation of any kind of regulation or oversight. And that is why we're having casualties, people who are victims of bad technology processes. So right now, we have a technology industry that first concentrates not only data, but also money and power. So we have a technology industry that has instituted itself as a key pillar of policy. We have tech millionaires deciding on educational policy. I've heard Bill Gates with his millions, he can influence global education policy. Elon Musk can decide that the global priority is not to solve and tackle poverty, but to go to Mars. And he can do that because he has a budget that is way greater than that of many countries on Earth. So we have created an industry that is extremely dysfunctional and a threat to democracy. We also have technologies that are reproducing bias. And that's one of the biggest ways in which we see citizens being affected by those systems. Because AI captures the data of reality and processes that data, if reality works against women, as it does, if reality works against vulnerable population, as it does, if reality discriminates against the old people, as it does, all those layers of discrimination are learned by these machine learning systems and reproduced by those systems around us. And so we have AI systems in the medical sector, in the educational sector, in security, that reproduce the discrimination of the most vulnerable in society in ways that are completely non-transparent and non-accountable. And so we have invested in those systems to make better decisions, and we're actually making worse decisions and more discriminatory decisions that are not held they're not required to be accountable. They're not held into account. We also have technologies that are very clearly open the door to political manipulation. And again, this has happened, and we're still struggling several years after Brexit and after the election of Trump and Cambridge Analytica. We're still struggling from the public sector to see how do we deal with this when it's such an urgent issue, because we are having systems that are fabricated, that are designed, conceptualized to manipulate their users from a political point of view or other point of view. We also have an industry that with its business model, depending on the economy of attention, is leading to global addiction to social media and technology systems. And again, if you go to a casino, that is regulated. Casinos are made to create addiction. But if you use an app or a system that is also designed to create addiction, none of those regulations apply, because for some reason we've afforded these tech bros the freedom to not comply with the laws that we so strictly impose on other sectors. And of course, we have a sector that is not only non-transparent, but also that on a daily basis infringes upon our privacy rights. I often use the example back in the 90s, if I would go back home from school and I decided to stay home on my own, no one knew. Maybe my mom knew it because I told my mom, listen, today after school, I'm going to go home. Maybe a neighbor saw me enter my building, but it was a space of privacy and intimacy. Today, when I'm in my home in the afternoon, the cameras on the street know, the smart appliances in my home know. If I have a smart TV or a smart fridge or a smart toaster, they know that I'm home. My electricity company knows, because now I have a smart meter that can see how I use electricity at every second and can have information on what I'm plugging into the system. My phone knows, and with my phone knowing, every single application that I have installed in my phone knows not only what I am, but also what I am doing, because if I'm interacting through my phone, all that activity is being recorded by those systems. So every single app in my phone knows exactly what I'm doing. If I'm using my desktop computer and connecting to the software of my employer and the software provider knows exactly what I'm doing. Some softwares can see the speed at which you type. So spaces like an afternoon at home that several years ago were still a space of privacy now have become a space of data gathering. And that is what is fueling the current revolution. The current technological revolution is not due to advances in technology. There hasn't been any significant advances in technology. We have been improving our processing capabilities for the last 40, 60 years. We've had machine learning models for a long, long time. What is fueling the current technological revolution is people's data. It's the information on how we work, what we do, who we love, who we talk to. That is the fuel of the current technological moment. And that's why ethics and equity and inclusion are important, because that data speaks about who we are, who we vote for, what we like to do, who our friends are, what our diseases may be. It's all this information that is fueling the power of these corporations. So what to do about this? There's a lot to do, of course, because the problem is large and very, very serious, and it is a threat to democracy. But I think that the first thing is to understand that privacy is more important than ever. As Carissa Velit says, privacy is power, but also that privacy is not only the right that we used to know, a privacy linked to the privacy of your communications. Right now, privacy is way broader than this. And so we need to see privacy as a gateway. Without privacy, there's a lot of rights that we cannot exercise. So it's not only a right in itself, but it's also the entry point to lots of other rights. So the need to protect and safeguard privacy is more important than ever. The second thing that we need to do is we need to recuperate politics as a space for the protection of people. Parliaments used to be spaces where politicians strategically anticipated what could happen to society and created the ways to protect us. With technology, this has completely failed. Up until today, I still have not heard any politician not make a fool of themselves when they speak about technology. They do not know. Technology is playing a huge part in our lives, and it's not part of the political programs of those that make decisions about the regulation. So we need to make sure that politics steps up their game, that they incorporate the technological element into their programs and plans, and then they start being proactive in creating the ways to protect us in those systems. We also need to audit these systems. These systems need to be more transparent and need to be open to external oversight. And I cannot emphasize how important this is. There's so many examples. In the 19th century, you could sell cocaine in a pharmacy. That was because there was no regulation. What's happening right now with technology, it's pretty much the same. We are selling cocaine in pharmacies. We are selling mechanisms of addiction and of erosion of privacy and democratic values without any kind of regulation. We need oversight of how this is happening and why this is happening. We need those systems to be audited. I am convinced that 5 years from now, we'll look back at 2021 and 2022 and be amazed that we were so non-prudent as to not audit systems. Would any of you buy a car without a seatbelt? None of you would buy a car without a seatbelt. No one would sell a car without a seatbelt, but cars don't need seatbelts. Seatbelts are the things that we have designed as a society to ensure that we can make the most of automobile innovation while protecting people. An
Gemma,
audit is the equivalent.
I don't know if you can hear me.
I can.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm very sorry to interrupt, but we have used more than the time that we had.
Sorry, I'm finishing, sorry.
Okay.
An audit is like the seatbelt of the artificial intelligence revolution. And finally, and I've stressed this point, so I'm not going to dwell into it anymore, we need regulation. We do need regulation that is implemented and that protects people in technology processes in practical ways. And apologies for going over my time. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. Thank you for these powerful remarks. And I've got some questions on accountability, responsibility, but we'll leave them for the dialogue part, because first we want to hear Anne Marie McGauren. She's here, and well, Gemma talked about inclusion, and it's time to ask her what is meant when we talk about digital inclusion, and most important, who are about to not be properly included now, and why is that problematic? So Anne Marie, let me handle the floor to you, the virtual floor, but let me hear you.
Thank you. It's great to be able to take part today. And hello from Ireland. Apologies about the fuzzy image. It's a bit about my Wi-Fi connection, not about the very good technical team in Barcelona. So if you could just show the slides, that'd be great. I'm going to talk today about what digital inclusion is. Next slide, please. And it's about everybody being able to contribute to and benefit from the digital economy and society. And that means having convenient and reliable access to affordable, accessible digital devices and an internet connection, and the ability to use these confidently in day-to-day life. Next, please. So why is it important to look at digital inclusion? There are a number of reasons. First of all, as we know from the other speakers and just generally looking around us, we are in the fourth industrial revolution, which is changing how business is carried out, how manufacturing occurs, how services are provided. Everything is becoming more and more digitalized. And it's really key that people are able to use these new technologies to be able to work and take part in society. Secondly, COVID has completely accelerated the reliance and use of digital technologies. We've used them for education, for employment, for socializing, for communicating. So it becomes really, really important that more people are digitally included and able to use these. Digital inclusion is important for social cohesion also. We cannot have various groups who are left behind, and I'll talk a little bit more about who those groups are. And another reason why it's good to focus on digital inclusion is because many countries have invested significantly. For example, my own country is investing $3.5 billion in providing broadband infrastructure. So the next logical step is to ensure that everybody can use this safely as well, of course, as Gemma said. And investment in digital inclusion is very cost effective. We know from UK studies that for every £1 that's invested, there's a £15 return, which is great. Next slide, please. So what are the dimensions of digital inclusion? Well, there's a number of kind of gateways, a number of tools that you need to be digitally included. So first of all, you need a good broadband connection. And when society was first becoming more digitalized, that was really the main area in which there was digital exclusion, because many areas didn't have broadband connections or people couldn't afford them. That has changed a lot, but it's still the case that 12% of households in the European Union don't have a broadband connection. And that can be due to their rural location or to income reasons. And even within that, the quality of people's broadband connection varies a lot. Some people just have mobile connections, and this really limits the extent to which they can fully take part in the digital world. Secondly, people need access to devices and to software to use them. And here, income levels really come into play. We found out during the various lockdowns that you really do need more than a mobile phone to take part in the digital world. Laptops became really important for education and for taking part in employment. Software also is an issue. It's constantly updated. To be fully digitally included, you need to be using new software and able to afford to buy it. And actually, this is one of the main dimensions now where people are less digitally included. Quite a lot of people don't have good devices, don't have up-to-date software. And so even though technically they are online, the quality of their ability to take part online is limited because of the devices and software they have. Next big issue then obviously is digital skills. And that's a very big issue. We know that 4 out of 10 people in the EU don't have even basic digital skills. And there are two parts to this, or many parts to this. There's the technical skills that people need. And a key issue here is that unlike reading, you can't just learn digital skills and then have them. They are constantly being updated. So people need to continually refresh their skills and learn more skills. And even the EU's own digital competence framework, DigComp, which was introduced in 2013, has had to be revised and expanded a number of times just in those 8 years because there's been so many developments in IT. I know from speaking to, for example, supports for older people, they talked about all the problems that occurred when new versions of Windows came out, and suddenly lots of older people were on the phone saying, I can't get into this, how does it work? So that's really a big issue, how to ensure that people have the most up-to-date digital skills to take part. And then the second issue that's very important here is content analysis, the extent to which people are able to grapple with the content of what they see to judge whether this is good information, whether it's misinformation, whether there's a scam. And we do find some people have good technical skills, but they don't have the good content analysis skills. That can happen to young people, for example. But we do find that people who don't have good technical skills also tend to be less aware of where they can be tripped up in terms of content. They're more likely to fall victim to scams. And people also then are very afraid when they hear about all the privacy and scam possibilities online, and that puts them off taking part in the digital world. And that brings me to the final point, which is having the confidence to engage with the digital world. That's another important part of digital inclusion. We know that, for example, a lot of older people say that they don't need the internet and they don't need the devices. But when we ask them what do they miss out on because they don't have them, they can come up with a big list: online discounts, being able to book their own flights, being able to access online banking, online public services, being able to be independent. They know that they're missing out, but they lack the confidence to make this leap into this new world. Next, please. So I've talked a bit just recently about those who are impacted by digital inclusion. We can see those in rural areas tend to have less broadband connection and less digital skills. Also, older people, they are the groups who are least likely to be online, although it does vary, of course. Some older people are good digital citizens. Those on lower incomes also tend to have less engagement online, less broadband connections, fewer devices, and those with less formal education. And there's a mix, obviously, in rural areas. We kind of have a whole lot of those. We have more older people, more people on lower incomes, and those with less education. So they really have a number of factors that are making them less digitally included. For migrants, digital world is a plus and a minus. It can keep you connected to your home country, but it can make it more difficult to engage with all the online world in the new country because it's all in a language that you don't understand. It can be more difficult to use a public service online than it is to go into a public service office and talk to somebody and get their help with the language. For businesses and farms, we can see that the smaller ones and those older owners and managers are less well digitally connected. There has been some changes since COVID, but the gradient is still there. Those in rural areas and those on lower incomes and lone parents still are falling behind the average in terms of digital skills and connections. And very importantly, you can't assume everybody will catch up. Maybe it's a bit like, getting more women into decision making. It doesn't just happen over time. And these digital exclusion is relevant, as I said, for accessing employment and training, accessing public services and private services like online banking, for communicating with people. We really saw that in pandemic, for making savings and for your security and for your own independence. I feel very sorry for many older people who are intelligent and well able to do things in the offline world, but suddenly find that they're at a huge disadvantage in the online world. So next slide. That's it. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Anne Marie. And now it's time for the dialogue. I have several questions. I will address them for one of our three speakers today, but they are open questions, so everyone is free to join and make this dialogue. So I ask for shorter answers, and I'll start with Simona. No? In line of the Keynesian theory of democracy, you promote the internet as a right, as a public service, not a service, as a public service. So how do you see the future of this service, considering that, in Europe, like 86% of people have access to the internet, they use the internet, but when we look at the global data, it's only 0.5% of the global population.
Yeah, I think if we talk about Keynes, and we want to reinterpret it in the current situation, I think we, before maybe, I don't know, motorway were one of the subject of applying Keynesianism. I think now we should apply Keynesianism to human rights. So as Gemma was saying, is that I think we were sharing in what we were saying, this same idea that the business model should be around the human right. Human rights should not be a feature like, do I put radio music in the car or do not? I think we should build, and we can build, because there is also a long history. One of the problems that I also share, that our politicians arrive very late to the internet, very, very late, the more late of the whole society. And so they understand the internet as, in some country where they don't have very good access, they think that internet is Facebook or Google, but is like thinking the public space as a big mall. So the mall are maybe getting a lot of the public space, but they are not the public space. And same with the internet. The internet is not this space in which you can permit or not to some big tech to do whatever they want. So, and the internet was born neutral, open to everyone. So there is a lot of potential of having a Keynesianism that invert in a very healthy space, and to invert around this possibility and not the opposite way around. And about the problem of connection, I think was Anne Marie already explained very well, and I have only to add one more thing, and because since I'm an activist, I tend to blame politicians. This is what I have to do. So there is a lot of problem around connection, etc. But one of the main problems that we have seen during the pandemic is that people, they don't have the broadband they are paying for. So this is one divide that we have not speak, is the part of our right to have a broadband enough to have a good conversation and a good use of the internet that we are paying for and that we are not receiving. And the politicians know that, because this happened, for example, in fields such as education or health. And we pay for a broadband, we don't get this. We had under power the instrument we have, and this can be solved very easily, I must say.
Let me ask Anne-Marie and Gemma if they feel optimistic about this future. For example, Anne-Marie said, we cannot expect that everybody will join in. We read that in one of her slides. So are you optimistic that about in 5 years, 10 years' time, almost everyone will get? Do you think that it will be enough, or do you think that this leads to 100% somehow in the future?
I think there will be an increase in connection to the digital world, because COVID has really underlined how hugely important it is, and needs that were maybe more hidden of less powerful groups who didn't have access have become much more visible due to the COVID lockdown. So I think a number of governments are realizing that they need to focus more on this. We have policies to help disadvantaged groups catch up in terms of education, health and income. So we do need it in this area as well. And in my own country, we have a new policy now relevant to digital literacy. And I know in several countries, there's debates about having connection to broadband as, as a universal service. And we have the European Electronic Communications Code, which also has stipulation about affordable, accessible broadband connections for everybody. So there are pieces that are coming there that are going to help more people to become connected, but it's going to take focus and it's going to take time.
And what about you? Gemma?
I'm convinced that the future will be better than the past. Maybe not ideal, but at least better for several reasons. First, because I think society is more and more aware of these issues, so there's more of a bottom-up pressure for the regulators to take this seriously. But also because we've had GDPR, the European Data Protection Regulation, for 5 years now. There's been a problem with the enforcement of this regulation, but now the courts are beginning to kick in. So we are seeing more and more instances of algorithms being ruled illegal in European courts, and that's going to happen more and more. There's a battery of court cases that are going to be decided in the coming months. The courts are slow, but they act. And because we have laws, even if the regulator is not proactive, the courts can act and are already acting. But also, we have 3 key pieces of legislation being discussed at the EU level at the moment. We have the AI Act, the Digital Services Act, and the Data Governance Act. So between 2022 and 2023, we'll have a battery of new regulation that will stop some of the most negative, hopefully stop some of the most negative dynamics in this market. So I do think that in the near future, in 5 years from now, I was saying before, every algorithm will be audited. I am convinced of this, and I think that the most negative dynamics inside of the technological industry will be at least limited, at least somewhat curtailed. It'll be more difficult to continue to do the worst practices that have been in place up until now.
Let me stay with you, Gemma, because we've talked about people who cannot access to the internet, but maybe we have to talk also of people who don't want to access to the internet. No, and let me touch upon the lack of trust between society and technology, and how to restore this trust. Because when it comes to this lack of trust, so do you consider us to be victims of technological processes, or do we overblame technology for social processes that we just don't like?
I think there is a tendency to blame technology for social dynamics that are too uncomfortable. I mentioned Brexit and Trump before. There's no proof that Cambridge Analytica actually managed to convince people to vote for Trump or for Brexit, people that would have voted something different. But I think we need to make a difference between Cambridge Analytica wanting to manipulate people and whether it managed to do that. So I think that wanting to manipulate people is something that needs to be stopped. The good news is that they probably didn't manage to do that. But I think sometimes for politicians, it's easier to blame an algorithm than to admit that we have large parts of the population that are willing to vote for someone like Donald Trump, or that are willing to vote for Brexit. So I do think that there's a tendency, because of this lack of understanding from the part of the politicians on how technology works, this tendency to blame technology for things that are too uncomfortable to deal with. But I think that trust is such a crucial issue. I think that we often underestimate the fact that trust is the glue that holds us together. There's no society without trust. Laws are only safeguards that we create for when trust fails. But the everyday fuel of our society is trust, and our ability to relate to one another under conditions of trust. What these technology dynamics are doing at the moment are eroding that trust. Large corporations are already seeing that. They're already seeing how the bad data practices are meaning that people use technology, but they hate technology. Pew Research in the US keeps telling us that people need to use technology because that's the only way to be connected. That was the only way to survive the pandemic, but we hate it. We hate Facebook. We hate all these large corporations. We just don't have an alternative. So there's a huge erosion of trust that we are seeing that is extremely concerning, because I think we are losing the social trust in innovation. And so the bad practices around data are basically killing the future of innovation, because people don't have the knowledge to separate between a good technology development and a bad technology development. There's all these companies that claim to be doing good, and then we realize that they've been selling our data to all these other actors. So people don't know anymore. So what they do is they distrust by default. And so basically every innovation in data that comes up now will be the object of a lot of distrust from society. So unless we stop these bad practices, I fear we will lose a lot of potential for innovation, because people will be less open to it, because they will just distrust by default, especially when it comes to technological improvements and innovations.
Okay, we've got a question from our audience that actually tackles this issue, and I'm going to read it to you now. What does the relationship between privacy and sustainability look like? So he asks, or she asks, there are some who would say we need to compromise on privacy to enable the full sustainability potential of digitalization. So what do you think? Is there a fundamental trade-off here or not? And I'm going to give and to present this question first to Simona.
So it's, as I was explaining, it's exactly the opposite way around, because to have good privacy with technology, we need to check their code, or check the algorithm, how they have been, the governance of the algorithm, to know which order have been given to the algorithm. And to do that, we need to open the code. And when we open the code, we have less need of redo the work several times. I don't know from which country is this person that writes, but in the country I work with, there is this terrible habit from the governance, especially, to ask for miraculous app over and over again, that they are presented all the time with the code which is not auditable, so it's completely copyrighted. And so we are investing public money all the time in reproducing app which we don't know what they do with our data, and especially that when we have to change the provider, we have to start from zero. So this is inefficient economically, and is absolutely not sustainable for our footprint in digitalization. So the solution is to have the code completely open, so that any entrepreneur can start from where we already are to create other solutions. And this would be more ecological, more sustainable, both in an economic and a human right way.
Anyone wants to add something to that? Then I'll move to the next question. This is for Anne Marie, actually, because we've talked about inclusion and to putting the citizen at the center. We've expressed that, I think, in different ways, but the point is that there is a third model. We have big state, we have big tech, and Europe is trying to promote a third model in which the citizen is in the middle. So to have a community-focused approach working, what do we need to have first in place? Please, Anne Marie.
I think the community focus is very important to get the most disengaged people engaged with ICT. Community organizations are known locally, and they can go out and engage with people who have less trust and who are fearful of engaging with ICT. We need a partnership approach with the public sector and the private sector, because they are providing so many services, and there are other issues, obviously, as we've heard today, and the third sector as well, because that helps to ensure access to services and networks and provides guidance and skills. And there's some interesting models in the UK. For example, Lloyds Bank funds an organisation that helps to train people in digital skills, and Lloyds Bank staff are volunteers in helping people with digital skills. So there are a lot of good models out there that we can build on. But I think it's important as well that the state would do better data gathering, so we can see which groups are the most disadvantaged, because we often use big surveys and it's very difficult to drill down into the situation of those kind of small groups, like, for example, those over 75, where there are probably a few million in the EU at least who are not able to use ICT. So we do need a better data gathering to be the basis of the work that the state and the private and community sector can do together.
Maybe, Simona, because I know that you're also an activist for many years, so you know a lot about social movements, and we tend to identify this citizen approach to Europe. I'm not sure if you have studied outside of Europe, if there are other countries which this issue rings a bell or resonates with them, because we tend to say, okay, US, China, and Europe in the middle. But what about the rest of the world?
And also I would like to add a bit of just say that we cannot consider anymore the relation like before, like state, private, and third sector only, which are important actors. But as I was saying in my previous speech, there is now a distributed model. So, for example, we have an experience in, I won't name an European country, which is not in a very good democratic shape recently. And so there were, for example, a corrupt public tender. And so what people does, the government want to give several million to a company which was friend of the government, and the people grab the contract, and in a distributed way, in a very few days, they build an open source tool with much less resources, and proving that there is a lot of talent which is distributed in society, and that the new digital era in which we live permit this distributed talent to be used. And I think there is many citizens that have a lot to bring to the society without having to enter in this hierarchy and a bit stiff structure, which of course is still there. I mean, I don't say we don't want states, we don't want a strong company, we don't want a strong sector, third sector articulate, but also we have to introduce the people. And so the people is everywhere. The people is not anymore people from here or people from there. There is, it's really everywhere in which we can integrate the talent in governance, and in development of tools for a more democratic digital era.
Okay, so this brings us to accountability, and I promised Gemma a question on accountability, because since AI systems work in an automated way, then the outcome are not the same as humans carrying out the same activities, no? So the humans bear full responsibility for the consequences, and apparently algorithms do not. So what should be done with, because this may lead to unethical questions or unethical dilemmas at least, and should society demand to be informed when they are engaging with an AI system when they are not aware of, for example?
I think that is crucial. We should know when we are engaging not with a human, but with a technical system, basically because they work completely different. An AI system just processes data. When we make decisions, we're not just processing data. We're taking into account lots of different things. An AI system, what it does is like what Netflix does. So the way that Netflix recommends the next movie is by looking at what have people watched in the past. So an AI algorithm would typically process data from the past, find patterns of what the majority did and understand that what the majority did in the past, it's what we want them to do in the future. So that's how an AI system works. It finds patterns in past data and implements them to the likely future. The problem with that is that when you're looking at what the majority did, you're of course forgetting minorities all the time. And so you're making decisions that are fundamentally biased. And so if you are the object of that decision and you are part of a minority, you may find that the recommendation that an AI system does to you does not fit what you actually need because you're not part of that majority. So I think that it is important that we understand that technical systems don't think, they process data, and that we are aware when it is a technical system that is making a decision, because we may be able to identify that that decision is unfair in our specific context. So I think that yes, we need to know when we are engaging with a technical system, but that's not enough. If I know that I'm engaging with a technical system, but there's nothing I can do about that solution or prediction that it imposes on me, what's the point of knowing? That knowing needs to lead to action. So we need to have ways to contradict or to challenge the algorithmic decision. And also we need to ensure that the information on how the system works is available to us in ways that we can understand. So again, the auditing, the implementation of explainability mechanisms is crucial. So it's not only about knowing that you are being managed by an algorithm, but also having something to do about it and knowing exactly how that system works. I think that just awareness is not enough for the seriousness of the challenges that we are facing.
And a very short answer to know if you are also in favor of not only accountability, but being aware of, but also transparency. Because of course, big firms, they say, okay, algorithm is our product. We cannot open up its secrets to the world. Do you think that you would regulate transparency?
No, we can't. Unfortunately, because of intellectual property rights law, transparency will always see a wall that we will not be able to surpass. So what we're doing is designing accountability measures that are as robust as transparency. The good news is that to audit artificial intelligence mechanisms, we don't need access to the code. We can audit without access to the code. We just need access to key data. And even if we don't have that key data, we can audit from the outside. We can do external audits. We can reverse engineer systems. We are currently doing that with several algorithms, both in Spain and in Catalonia and all over the world. So we are working with the collectives that are affected by those algorithms. We're talking about recidivism algorithms, algorithms used in the criminal justice system, algorithms used in banking, and algorithms used in hiring. So we are working together with civil society organizations to reverse engineer those systems. So we can get information on how these systems work without having access to the code. And unfortunately, the principle of transparency, it's something that we've been trying to have access to for a long time, but it's just been impossible because there's other rights that stop us from having access to those pieces of information. But again, there is good news. We do not always need access to the code to audit a system, and sometimes we don't even need the complacency of the developer or the implementer of the system to know how the system works, because we can reverse engineer it on the basis of its outputs. So I think that the era of opacity around AI is about to end, because civil society, the regulator, and the population in general is arming itself with the tools to reverse engineer those systems and start putting blame where blame is due when these don't work.
We have still 2 minutes left, and I think that all of this leads to inclusion. And I'd like a quick question to Anne Marie McGauren. So what can policymakers actually do to enhance this inclusion? I know that 1 minute won't solve the problem, but if you could outline a couple of measures, we will be glad to end up with this.
I think a good, clear focus on this is useful. A number of countries have evidence-based plans with funding and good data looking at the groups who need support, and that this would be a great help. I think it's very important to target supports at those who are the most disadvantaged, and to provide a lot of support for people to upskill constantly, because a lot of the upskilling is kind of one-off, but it needs to be constant. So they would be the key things to do, I think, moving forward.
Then we're done, and thank you for these inspiring comments, Simona Levi, Gemma Caldon, Anne Marie McGauren. It's time for me to hand the floor again to Miranda. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. What a terrific panel that was. A really good discussion on artificial intelligence, the concerns that we have around privacy protection, concerns about inclusion. How do we develop algorithms in such a way that they are actually helpful to all and not just favoring a few? We see that there are many regulatory gaps right now, and I think this panel did a terrific job in pointing out some of these challenges to us. We're going to continue with our discussion on artificial intelligence and the role that this plays in advancing and sometimes challenging European values. So I'm very happy to welcome to our studio here Andrea Rodriguez, who's a real expert in this area. She's working in the Global Cities program here in the Barcelona Center for International Affairs. We're very happy to have you here, Andrea. And to start, it might be helpful for all in the audience if you can tell us a little bit about what you're doing there.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank the organization for inviting me to be here with you all today and to be able to respond to your questions and to discuss and speak about a topic that I think is so crucial as the digital transformation, right? And to respond to your question, what do I do? That's a hard thing to respond, that is true. Within the Global Cities program, what I do is to research on the human-centric and anthropocentric digital transformation. And like right now, what we are doing is we have developed we launched an Observatory of Global Urban Artificial Intelligence Systems back in July 2021, and we are developing ethical guidelines for cities to develop their own AI capacities, but also for them to review their policies and to use that for further policy making in a way that both includes citizens and includes, of course, like research and state-of-the-art practices. But besides that, I also collaborate with other institutions in the development of the European digital agenda. So I'm very present in all the debates here in Barcelona, but also in Brussels, surrounding, for example, the development of the latest digital policy papers such as DSA, DMA, AI Act, and many other names that might sound a little bit unfamiliar, but I promise you they're not that hard.
It sounds like you've got an exciting job, really important issues that you're working on. And maybe you can tell us a little bit where you see the need here with development of policies and programs that can help us understand ways in which we can better protect citizens, minorities, disadvantaged groups, and protect the norms that are important for Europe. How do you do that? How do you actually develop policies and programs that might advance this at the European level?
Well, that is a very good question. I think that the first thing that we need to be aware of is that the digital transformation is not something that it's going to happen. It is happening, and it has happened. And the problem of that notion is that it happened without proper guidelines on how to develop that. So for instance, when we're speaking about digital policy, we're very concerned on creating like new governance frameworks, but we often tend to forget that the private sector already has these governance frameworks in place since a very long time ago. So for example, if we're speaking about AI, companies that develop AI products and sell them to public administrations and other companies, or even directly to customers, to citizens, they know how to govern those algorithms, like who is responsible if something goes wrong, like how to ensure that everything goes according to the plan. But the plan, of course, is interest-driven. And when I mean interest-driven, I say like revenue-driven. So one of the key challenges that we're having when developing policies is how to translate those frameworks to the public administration, and of course, how to develop these frameworks from a point of view that include absolutely everyone. So I think that those are like two key topics at the time of development. Like one, being aware that we are not on the verge of something. We are already in it. If we consult something, we're probably going to use our phone. So if we tend to think of the digital transformation of something that is about to come, we're failing to view all the challenges that already are there in place. And the second thing is, it's taking into account that there's like other actors already with a governance framework. How do we translate that in a manner that it's that supports our conception of what a digital transformation should be like? And we know what that digital transformation should be like. It should respect human rights, such as the right of non-discrimination, but it also has to make everyone thrive in the digital era. So that's why some things that, for example, Simona Levi was saying before, is so important. Like, you cannot have this unless you guarantee that everyone has equal access to the internet.
So that's a super important point. We heard quite a lot about that just now, about the lack of equal access, partly a problem that not everybody has the technological tools to have access, partly because they maybe don't have the training or the skill set necessary. And then there's a whole different level, which is those who are actually programming, those who are actually establishing the algorithms that are determining how machines tick. And I'm wondering what we can do to include more people. What are the steps that are necessary to enhance capacity and skills? And then we'll go on with some additional questions.
So in that regard, it is true that we're lacking skills on so many levels. We're lacking skills on people who deal with these technologies every day, and we think that they're like magically programmed, because there is a super friendly user interface, which means that if I press this button, everything is gonna work. But many people cannot even reach that stage, because you need many other things. I remember, for example, my grandparents, where they tried to send me a message, they would be like, okay, no, because they haven't dealt with this technology. So basic skills are very necessary, and we need to improve that. But also we need to improve the skills on how technology works on itself, because we need to be able to understand what is happening inside to know whether or not we should be using that technology or not. It doesn't mean that everyone needs to program an application. That's not what I mean. But what I want to say is that we need to be able to use our devices and to understand our devices, because they carry all our personal life. And not only that, like your other question was about like skills on a major on a major level. We're lacking also ICT people working here in the EU, for example. So if we want to reach our goals of that we set by 2030, we need at least 20 to 30 million people more working in ICT, and the foresight is not that. So if we need that people, what is the thing that we're not going to be looking into? Things such as gender, because we need the skills. And if we want the skills to be balanced, then we have another super bad idea here. We have like a really bad, let's say, like we have really bad news. And that is that as of the total ICT population, only a few, like a very small percentage are women. Mm-hmm. So then we have to balance another thing out for the future. Do we want to reach our digital transition goals? How do we want to reach that? And what weights more, like having the ICT people to develop these tools, or having that workforce being gender balanced?
That's a topic that's true to my heart. I think getting the gender dimension in is super important. You'll notice that we put a lot of emphasis on that here. We had a lot of female speakers in our annual conference this year. I'd like to keep on this topic of inclusion, but bring it in a little bit. You have in the title of your company the Global Cities Program. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering how cities fit in here. And I'm wondering that in part because one of the things that the European Environment and Sustainable Development Advisory Council's network is focused on are the questions of transformations that are digital transformations, but also, for example, sustainability transformations. And here we also heard a little bit about smart cities, and I'm wondering, how do we link inclusion? Why is it important for the development of programs at the city level that might help us to be more sustainable from an ecological perspective and more inclusive? How do you bring this in when you're thinking about this at the urban level?
So I think that we need to take into account that cities are going to be the place where most of the population will live in 20, 30 years' time. And that means that city administrations and local administrations will have a key role to play when training people in when managing data flows. And I think that both things are really important because, first of all, in order to be able to give the best services to a growing population in the same or also an expanding geographical area, what you need is to be aware of your territory and what it needs. And you're going to sensorize your city to do that because you want to know when, like which area of the city needs an upgrade in infrastructure. You need to know which area of the city has been more polluted in order to create like special policies for that. So cities have a really important role to play when it comes to inclusion and digital inclusion as well, because if you have more people living in neighborhoods that do not have enough access to the internet, then you're going to have people who are going to lack opportunities in the digital era. But talking about sustainability, of course, that also gives them another like big weight. They need to work on policies that will create like greener cities because they're the center of pollution, simply because people work, live, thrive, entertain themselves, and just do their lives in cities. So when I think about that from the perspective of the digital transformation, I try to think of three things, like how do our tools impact the green, like the green goals of the cities, and what specific items should I be looking at? So in July, when we started working in the observatory, the first output that we put out is a framework of ethical standards. And we wanted to include sustainability as one of our ethical standards. Because if we want AI systems to respect people's rights, we need to also make AI systems respect people's rights to the city. And people's rights to have like a healthy life. And you cannot have it in a polluted environment. So in this principle that we developed, sustainability, we look at three different things. First, on devices. Are we over-sensorizing the city? Are we over-polluting our city with devices that are going to become obsolete so soon and that we don't have the proper mechanisms to recycle them? How do we decrease the electronic waste? How do we recycle and reuse what we have? How do we transform our current devices for them not to pollute so much? The second thing we were looking at is the processing of the data, because we get the data when we send them to a data center so far away, and what happens to that data center, I don't want to know. If that data center is fueled using coal, well, that's something that is within my agreement. Like, I don't know how do you fuel your data centers, but I just want my data to be processed. So we put an extra emphasis on how do we process the data? Can we process the data in a way that is environmentally friendly? So those are the things that we're looking at when we're trying to reconciliate both things. An important thing is that we called our framework a minimal ethical standard framework. So if you do not comply with the sustainability principle, you're not complying with our minimal ethical standards, and therefore your system will not be ethical. So that's a way I think to conjugate both transitions. I really encourage you to take a look because it's really interesting, and we're open for feedback.
I love it. I really like that the minimal standards, the minimal ethical standards are based, at least in part, on sustainability criteria and the information, what it is, how it's being used, the data, how it's being processed and what that means ecologically. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about how you define ethics and how you decide what these basics are, and then also tell us a little bit about how you're feeding that into the European level. What kind of advising are you doing there?
Also, how do I define ethics? I think that we could be speaking about this for hours, and probably many philosophers would kill me if I even attempt to give a definition of that. So that's why we are working with minimal ethical standards, because we realized when we were doing this first stage of research that trying to agree on a common definition of ethics was going to be a very complicated thing. So what we did is I read more than 20 different documents dealing with AI ethics, and I saw what were their definitions. And then what I did was to take out the different principles they were speaking about and try to find like common ground. So in the end, I had 20 documents speaking about 19 different principles, which was too much. So the 6 principles that they agreed the most on, those are the principles that I moved to the framework, and I enriched them with with the lessons from the rest. So for example, on inclusion, we have the main point of our framework is fairness and non-discrimination. But we also include there like inclusion, diversity in who builds the programs, but also diversity in the data set, representativeness of the data. We want to map, even though it's complicated and completely a utopia, how the world outside looks like. So the algorithm knows that and it doesn't discriminate, at least on a first stage. There's many other ways it can do it. So that's one thing. The connection with the European digital agenda is that many of the documents that I was reviewing, they were documents that were commissioned by the European Commission to experts. And we also offered a policy toolbox, more or less, and we took that inspiration from the work that the European Commission is doing, because I think we're very aligned in that sense. And I think that my connection with the EU, in the sense of like policy making, it's in the sense of trying to include other actors, subnational actors, to the discussion on how to create better policies, because the EU oftentimes tends to look very, very much at the private sector, the national level, and the international level, but we tend to forget, or the EU tends to forget, there are like other actors actively making policies. So, for example, the Barcelona City Council strategy on AI was the first one of its kind, and it includes specific requirements for the procurement of algorithms. That's something that you cannot do. So looking at those experiences it's a way to doing that. So when I go to Brussels and we discuss about the AI Act, for example, I tend to bring all these like lessons from Barcelona, and it's been really useful, because you get the philosophy, let's say, like how they use doing things, but you get also the implementation level of the real challenges when you come here and you do it with cities on the ground.
Could you take us one step back? That was just terrific. But you mentioned you've got the 6 ethical minimal standards.
Mm-hmm.
Can you walk us through the 6?
Oh, that's perfect. So the first one is fairness and non-discrimination. Mm-hmm. I think it's basic to having any AI system out there. The second one is safety and cybersecurity. We differentiate between those two. Safety refers to no harm, and no harm in many ways. So for instance, like no physical harm would be a thing. And I always put the same example. There's like cities developing some systems that would identify a person when it's crossing the street badly. When I say safety, I mean, what is the level of robustness of the system? Not to say, okay, this person is not a person, therefore, the tram goes out and that person can be overrun. Like, that's something that we don't want, so that's safety. Mm-hmm. And then cybersecurity, protection against external threats. The third one we have is privacy protection, which is basic, and I think we have spoken largely about this issue. Transparency and openness. Transparency, and that's something that Gemma says it's hard, but we tend to look at that as interpretability and explainability, in the sense of can you explain how the algorithm took that decision, and can you explain that to someone who's not technical, so that person can from its judgment, her judgment or his judgment, decide whether or not he wants to use that. And I think both things are important, but openness in the sense of the public administration saying, hey, we're using this algorithm, what do you think? And if you find like any malfunction, go report it to me, because I may want to know it. And I'm looking at many other issues. So maybe having the help with citizens will be very useful. The fourth thing, I have already mentioned 4. The fifth thing is of course, sustainability. And the 6th is accountability and responsibility.
I like it. I really like it, because you're finding a way to have a fairly manageable, understandable approach to thinking about basic ethical dimensions that can really have major implications. And you've also given us a few examples of how an algorithm that perhaps doesn't take this into consideration can cause deadly accidents, real big problems. Could you help us also understand a change that perhaps has come about as a result of your work? What are some of the improvements that we're starting to see? Because one thing we've talked about the last few days are some of the gaps in the existing policies and programs. And of course, for many of those who are viewing this, they're involved in advising national governments and sometimes regional governments in ways that change can lead to improvements and help us to achieve our goals. What do you think are the best ways to bring these kinds of advice into systems that are complex, maybe not so easy for policymakers to understand? What do we need to do?
I think is the role of the translator. That's something that you need to do. You need to have someone who's able to translate technical knowledge to a non-technical audience, and that's the only way to help the message pass through. And as of the impact of these standards and the work that we're doing, we don't know yet. It's been really recent. The observatory is only 4 months old, 5 months, less than 5 months old, and August was in the middle, meaning that we were on the beach and not working. So I think that that we're yet to see like where this road takes us. But I've been presenting this this framework this week from many different places. I was in Brussels yesterday, speaking about the digital agenda. I was in the Smart City World Expo 2 days ago, presenting the framework in front of many people from different cities in the Cities Coalition for Digital Rights Assembly. And I think that that people are starting to feel aware that this is important and that we need to speak about this. And that's another connection with Europe. That's something that the European Union wants to pursue. And it believes that if we are already engaged in this thing, we cannot go back. We cannot go back to analogic. And what we're having is like different players who are not Europeans, who have other values, who are not European, and that maybe do not want to put the people at the center because they follow interest, or they follow revenue, or they follow some kind of like big strategy that make them like have this specific weight on the market. And I think that both things are really important, right? And that showcase how important these things are being for cities, for the European Union, and for European citizens as well.
One of our earlier questions was raising this diametrically opposed concept. One is that we need, in a sense, more top-down, perhaps, regulated approaches to dealing with sustainability. So you have smart meters in your homes, you have smart technologies that are helping us to understand energy use and how to save energy, or perhaps to monitor traffic and make it smoother. On the other hand, we have this question of privacy. We have the question of how could this data be used in ways that are perhaps detrimental to individual freedoms. How do you see these kinds of diametrically opposed concepts? Are there ways of improving and enhancing sustainability through the use of digital applications, connecting and interconnecting in ways that really aren't invading our privacy? How can we do that?
I think we can do that, but we need to pay extra attention to the principles of necessity and proportionality. And I think that looking into these two key elements, it's essential for any policy to respect people's privacy and to follow a goal that it's by itself ethical. And then I could go back to the definition into that talk. But you put and you mentioned a couple of very clear examples, like to put sensors in your house can be a good idea, right? Because it knows, like, your smart system knows when you're there. So, for example, you're there and it's December and not in Barcelona. I mean, December in Paris, for example, it's super cold there. And you want your house to be heated up when you arrive. So maybe like sensoring in your house would be a good idea, because then you can like send a petition and say, hey, I'm going to be there in 20 minutes. Or there is an AI system that predicts that every day you get home at 6 p.m. and then it is like intertwined with already like data sets, and it says, okay, so outside is like this cold, and let's try to heat up the house in a way that is efficient and in a way that is like energy saving. So that's a very good application, but who builds these applications? Like, where is the data stored, processed? Who has access to that data? Like, will that data be sent to a third party that would want to know when I get home? And why? What if this third party is, I don't know, like a band of robbers, and they know, okay, so this person has been, like, arrives home at 5 p.m., but sometimes, like, she arrives home like a half an hour later or a half an hour before, therefore I'm gonna go there and I'm gonna steal, I don't know, the smart TV. So I think that it's all about how do you play that out? And what if you do it, like, not only at the individual level, but on a larger scale? Like, who has access to that? And can you use those things to retrieve more data that you haven't been allowed to access? So, for example, like conversations, or I don't know, like the image. Like people and kids are playing with the smart assistants, and the smart assistants are not part of the European AI Act. They're one of the exemptions, like home assistants. So we need to look on these issues if we want both things to happen, right? And again, we need to think of sustainability as something that is key and that is necessary for the digital transition, as well as we need to think of the digital transition as something that is necessary to ensure the energy transition into the green transition.
I like how you say there are ways we can deal with this, and we can move forward, but we do have to be careful, and we have to develop some structures around how we're using artificial intelligence. And I think that might also become something where when we think of other areas of sustainability like health, that becomes something where privacy of data is really a very important question, and how it's being used and who has access to it. So I can very well understand why we need to think about this much, much more than we have. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit more where you see European discussions right now in relationship to the artificial intelligence control, the acts that are being formed, and also in terms of digital services, policies and programs. Where do you think we're at? Do you see good progress? Do you see big gaps that need more attention?
I think we have finally woken up, and I'm optimistic, but I'm pragmatically optimistic. So the policies that we're seeing coming out, they're not perfect. And probably after the whole process of the European Union, that it will take forever for them to pass, they will not look the same, so they will be watered down. And that's something that we need to be aware of. I think that, for example, in terms of AI, it was a very brave thing what the EU did, which is try to put 27 countries to think together and to have a legislation that is international within the scope of its application, which is the European Union, but international in the sense that it's 27 countries, and to have them agree on common rules on how to govern AI. But when we think about this thing, for example, we're not saying that the AI Act is an ethic-based regulation. It is a risk-based regulation. And I think that we need to take that into account when we're reviewing that, as well as we need to take into account that the European Union is not a political union.
Before we get into the political dimension, can you help us and the listeners also understand what you mean, the difference between a risk-based and an ethics-based act?
Ethics, basically what it wants to say, what is good and what is bad. And there's like many nuances, and if there's like someone like a philosopher out there will be like saying, hey, that is not the whole truth, which is correct. But in a few words that say, like ethics say, what it wants to say is, okay, you can do this. This is ethical. So it's fine, and you cannot do this because it's unethical. You cannot kill a person because that's unethical. But I don't know, but you can go to war, you can just like go and try to rescue someone because that's ethical. There is a purpose there that says that it's good. A risk-based application or like risk management, what it says is, okay, nothing is good or bad, you need to be careful. And I think that's the main difference. Like nothing is inherently bad, which means that in this piece of regulation, nothing is by itself prohibited. And that can cause many tensions. So here in Europe, we're having lots of discussions on whether or not we should ban facial recognition systems. And we're working on that specifically on the Observatory, like how to create a report that will inform like public administrations, cities, if they want to implement the systems, how to implement those systems. But the proposal does not cover this thing. It speaks about real-time biometric surveillance systems or real-time biometric identification systems. So that's the difference between risk and ethics. Like because many people think that is bad and it should be banned, but then the risk-based approach is like, okay, let's not get into discussions of whether it's good or bad. If someone decides to do that, how you can do that to guarantee that everything is done in the most privacy-preserving or rights-preserving way.
And if we go back to what you were saying about the political union, you were mentioning that it's been quite a challenge, but also it's terrific that it's happening in a bloc of 27 countries.
It is true. I was saying that because the proposal it's meant for an economic union, not a political union. So having people agree on interests that are so dear to their development in terms of like growth, and even they could even think of this regulation as harming their national interest, because they're like sovereign, they have like defense interests and military interests and so on and so forth. That's terrific. But that's why I wanted to punctualize this thing. It's meant for the market. It's meant for European companies to thrive on the market at the national level, meaning at the European level, and at the international level outside of the European Union.
I'm learning so much here. It's exciting. One of the things I'm wondering is who's doing the advising in terms of your group, and what other kinds of groups do you see active here? So I'm looking at you and thinking, well, you're probably a generation younger than I am, and that we're seeing young people moving in and saying we need to be thinking about this, probably because the young people are the ones who have the most exposure to thinking about artificial intelligence and digital technologies. Are you seeing other communities also being included in these kinds of discussions, and are they able to be included? So I'm thinking here, for example, of older populations, and how can we bring their concerns into these discussions?
I think that political bodies tend to think that the population is a homogeneous population. So that means that everyone is middle-aged, has the same problems, has the same purchasing power, and therefore we need to regulate for them and the rest. And I think that fortunately, the young people are being like more included into the discussions, but that is true that maybe older people are not so included. I don't advise the European Union. I participate in the debates around the policies that are coming out, and you can see like more young faces participating in there. But it is true that when you discuss certain policies and you speak with activists, with NGOs, with private sector and with public sector, it is true that you can feel that generational gap normally affecting the older people. And that's something that we should be looking at, because we tend to create policies for the future. Let's think of this program. Is the next generation EU the thing that we're dealing with? Next generation meaning that we're trying to put the foundations for the next generation to thrive in a European political union. But what about those people who are already here? Like, are they being left behind? Maybe we should put extra emphasis on that.
And one other aspect that really interests me is the question of the time. How much time do we have to set these rules before we have developments that become institutionalized and hard to change? You started us off and said, we're already there, we've already begun, and the businesses are already establishing certain kinds of rules and structures. Are we moving fast enough politically to deal with the reality that once rules are established, we know that they're very hard to change again?
Oh, there's a simple answer to that: no. We're not moving fast enough, and I think that we are aware that we're not moving fast enough, because we live in a democratic system that has its timings and you need to consult things. If we lived in an authoritarian state, or in an authoritarian, let's say, European Union bloc, that would be easier, because whatever one person says, it's a rule and tomorrow can be implemented. But it's a different thing. So, for example, taking into consideration the publication of the EEAC Act, the proposal was released on April 2021, and it is expected to be implemented around 2023, 2024. By the time it is there, we don't know how the market is going to look like. We don't know what will be the recent developments in AI. But then comes the political management. And I think, like, being a strategic genius to some extent, if you know that your timing is not going to do well in the way that you want to create policies, what you need to do is try to create policies that are as flexible and as adaptable as possible. So once it gets out, you can adapt whatever is out there to what you thought 4 years ago, that should be the way. And that's, of course, there's another challenge there, because maybe you think differently, but you don't have the time to develop that. But I think that is that's something that we need to balance out. And I think that's something the EU is trying to balance out in the most, let's say, sensitive way, because it's still, it has its priorities clear. The digital transformation needs to be there for absolutely everyone to profit from.
Something that I think is so important here in what is happening is that Europe is really trying to catch up and lead in this area of digitalization and the transformations that are around it. Participatory democratic norms are something that are central also to the sustainability transformation. We know that we're working in a world where not all countries share the same values that Europe holds dear. Personally, I see this as a super important area, one where if we don't pay attention to potential threats associated with digitalization and artificial intelligence, that we could pay a very heavy price in the long run. So I'm hoping you can do two last things in our little interview here. One is tell us how you trained yourself to do what you're doing. You're a very eloquent speaker. It's really been a pleasure to be listening to you. And then the second, a last message to our viewers, what would it be?
I think the last message is that we all need to be part of this, and we need to demand from the people governing us to keep working on that, not only at the European level for European citizens, but outside. I wrote an article a few months ago for CITOP called Europe Needs More Digital Diplomacy. And it basically said that if we're doing super nice policies here that, for example, preserve the privacy of the European citizens, we need to expand that, and we need to work with third countries, because otherwise the big companies are going to go to any place in Africa. And I'm not saying that from a Eurocentric perspective that everything in Africa is worse, but because in Africa there is more than 50 countries without any data protection laws. So companies would go there, retrieve the data they need to train their AI products, and then sell them certified in Europe and be like, hey, we're preserving the data of European citizens. But they're like having this, unfortunately, colonialistic practices outside. So I think that would be my first message. Like, let's not think that everything we're doing is correct. Let's try to push it, and let's try to really get international governance on these issues. And as in, how do I train myself? I don't know. I just really enjoy being with people and speaking to people and having amazing interviews and conversations as the one that I had here with you.
Well, thank you so very, very much. It's been really a terrific, informative interview. I wish you a lot of success in what you're doing. It's really important. Very encouraged to see people who are as skilled as yourself helping us think at the European level as well as here in Barcelona about what the next steps are to protect ourselves and take the digital developments in a positive direction. So thanks for your work, and good luck.
Thank you very much.
And we will now head into the last elements of our annual conference. We are wrapping up here after 3 days of really terrific conversation. I'm going to just quickly mention a few of the topics that have caught my attention in the last days. We have spent a lot of time thinking about how the digital transformation can move us forward in dealing with sustainable development challenges like climate change and biodiversity loss. We have talked a lot about what the digital transformation is and the role of artificial intelligence systems. We have understood that digital transformation also means thinking about the use of information, the collection of information, the ability and speed with which information can be gathered and analyzed leads to new possibilities and power. It can help us deal with health problems, with energy challenges, with the mobility transition, with smart cities and education. So there's a lot of possible positive things that we're seeing here. We have seen the European Union move forward with the Green Deal, with the recovery policies and programs that are in place that are also helping to create new frameworks for dealing with sustainability challenges, as well as the digital transformation, including Europe's Digital Europe 2030 plans and programs. At the same time, in the last few days, we've talked about the lack of integration of sustainability into digital policies and programs, that we need much more connection between these twin challenges. And we've discussed the fact that Adam Smith's free hand has led to a rather large ecological footprint, and that we need new approaches that are more collaborative and integrative. Inclusion and participation have been very central to the discussion. We've talked a lot about the urban transformation. We've mentioned the need to make sure that we also don't leave communities behind, and that the rural community will also be experiencing transformations as a result of digitalization. We have talked about the impacts that are not equal among all groups in society, and that we have to be careful that as digitalization and artificial intelligence advance, that we don't have heightened gender inequalities and other forms of discrimination. And this means that we need to help different communities build capacities, increase access, and make sure that they have the skills necessary to do content analysis. The discussions continued to focus in on the protection of European norms, privacy, and democracy, and the problems with the business models that until now have been developing very rapidly, but have not really incorporated sufficiently ethical dimensions into their designs, and that this really needs to change, because we do not want to see a future where European norms have been negatively impacted as a result of rapid, uncontrolled technological change. And that's the word, control. We need to be careful and ask ourselves, who's controlling the digital transformation? Do we have privacy and do we have discrimination as a result of it? Or can we control the use of this technology so we have privacy by design and distributive democracy? This means we need to think more about our frameworks, the regulations we have, and how we understand these twin challenges. And on that final note, I would like to say a word of thanks to Arnoud Queralt-Bassau, who is the chair of the European Environment and Sustainable Development Advisory Councils. He has sat in on all of our discussions the last 3 days. He has been a tremendous power behind organizing this conference, helping to think about the content, the focus. He has really brought in his networks and managed to even get the president of the region into the office here, into the studio here. It's really tremendous what you've been able to do, Arnaud. So thank you so very much. And
thank you to you.
The floor is yours.
Thank you, Miranda, for your kind words. And thank you for guiding us so skillfully through the past 2 days. And thank you for providing us with the summary of the main messages of our conference. On behalf of the EEAC network, I would like to thank the speaker for their insightful and meaningful contributions. And I would like to thank CATS, the member of CATS, the staff of CATS, for hosting us here. On Wednesday, at the start of this conference, the president of the government of Catalonia invited us as a network to share the key findings and conclusions of the conference with him. We will, of course, also share this with the EEAC member councils, European institutions, and other interested parties. The insights and reflections shared these past 3 days allow us to bring forward a set of observations and recommendations. 3 of these observations I would like to share with you now. First is the necessity to better integrate the green and digital transformation. Governments and parliaments must step up their actions to ensure that both transitions will be handled in an integrated fashion. Second, governments need to take steps to prepare for any unintended consequences caused by the digital transformation. inclusive participation will be key to achieving societal acceptance for the major transformations ahead. Third, we call upon EU institutions to seize up on the opportunities that digital transformation provides for furthering action against climate change and other sustainability challenges, while also taking a global lead in formulating standards and rules to protect European democratic values. For this, more emphasis needs to be placed on integrating the twin challenges and strengthening our positions as a sustainable digital and tech frontrunners. In our lecture, we will further elaborate our views on these important issues, and we will sketch possible pathways to advance both the green and digital transitions while mitigating against unintended negative consequences. And now, prior to end the session, to close the EEAC conference, I would ask two people from the staff of CATS and the EEAC Secretariat, to come to the stage, let's say, in order to close the session together with Miranda. They are not alone. We have other people just working in the office from the virtual world, and we consider that they should be here represented by Michiel and by Fina Batlle. So, ladies and gentlemen, I bid you farewell from our studio here in Barcelona, in the beautiful Recinte Modernista de Sant Pau, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. We just celebrated 30 years of the World Wide Web. Next year, the EEAC network can look forward to hosting its 30th annual conference. We look forward to meeting you there. Thank you for joining us. We hope that you have learned as much as we feel we have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arnau.
Thank you.